The stage lights fade, leaving only a single microphone standing in the quiet. Once, that mic carried a voice that built another man's legend, a sound that changed America. His rhythm made the world dance, yet his name never made it to the marquee. Before there was the godfather of soul, there was the man who helped him rise, the one who kept the band together, who turned gospel fire into the spark of funk. But what happens when the architect of a sound is left in the shadows of his own creation? This is not just another story about James Brown. It's the story of Bobby Byrd, the heartbeat behind the legend, the voice history almost forgot. Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab a warm drink, sit back, and join us as we remember the man the world forgot, because here, we give legends their flowers. Long before his name ever reached a record label, Bobby Byrd's voice echoed through the small wooden walls of a Georgia church. He was born on the 15th of August, 1934, in Toccoa, a modest town where Sunday mornings were filled with gospel choirs, and music was a language of both faith and survival. His family was deeply rooted in the church. They weren't famous or wealthy, but they were respected, the kind of people who believed in community, music, and redemption. In those days, segregation defined everything in the South. For a young black boy, dreams of fame were as distant as the stars above the steeple. But every time Bobby sang with his church group, the Zioneers, he felt something shift inside him, a sense that music could carry him beyond those boundaries. His sister, Sarah, sang beside him, and together they turned every Sunday service into a celebration of hope. The church was his first stage, the congregation his first audience. And while most of his neighbors saw music as worship, Bobby saw something more, a calling. That calling took him from small-town gospel to a wider world of rhythm and blues. By his teenage years, Bobby joined the Gospel Starlighters, a group that blended spiritual harmonies with a new, daring rhythm. But the times were changing. Church leaders warned them that secular music was a dangerous path. Still, Bobby and his friends couldn't ignore the pull of a new sound, something raw, emotional, and deeply human. They left Georgia and traveled through South Carolina, performing under a new name, the Avons. It was the first of many reinventions that would define Bobby's life. In 1954, they became the Five Royals. A year later, they settled on a name that finally felt right, the Flames. Bobby played piano and organ, led the vocals, and shaped the group's tone. He wasn't just a singer, he was a leader, someone who held things together when everyone else drifted. Then came a moment that would change his life forever and, in time, change the sound of American music. During a casual baseball game at a local juvenile facility, Bobby met a young man named James Brown. Brown was serving time for robbery, but behind the wire fence, Bobby saw more than a convict, he saw potential. He heard a voice that carried both pain and power. After the game, Bobby introduced himself. They talked, they laughed, and they sang a few bars. Something clicked. When Bobby returned home, he told his parents about the young man. They agreed to sponsor Brown's release and help him find a new direction. It was an act of faith, the kind of faith that changes destinies. That single decision created one of the most defining partnerships in American soul music. When Brown finally joined the Flames, he started out as the group's drummer. But it didn't take long before his charisma and his hunger for the spotlight pulled him forward. Bobby, older and steadier, recognized the spark in him. He wasn't threatened by it. He wanted to shape it. "I didn't need him as competition," Byrd would later say. "I needed him with me." In that moment, their dynamic was born. Bobby was the backbone. James was the face. Together, they found a sound that balanced gospel passion with street rhythm, something raw, alive, and unstoppable. They changed their name once more, becoming the famous Flames. It was more than just a band. It was a brotherhood, a dream that carried the hopes of every Southern kid who'd ever wanted more. In the quiet corners of rehearsal halls, Bobby taught Brown discipline, how to lead a group, how to listen to timing, how to control an audience. Brown, in turn, pushed Bobby toward bolder performances. The two men learned from each other, creating a chemistry that was both creative and combustible. They didn't know it then, but they were about to write a new chapter in American music, one where gospel became soul, and soul became funk. For Bobby, it all began in that small church in Georgia, with a piano that was slightly out of tune, and a congregation that believed music could save a soul. He didn't chase fame, he chased meaning. And somewhere between faith and funk, he found his purpose. By the mid-1950s, the sound of rhythm and blues was spreading through America, and Bobby Byrd was right in the middle of it. After recruiting James Brown into the Flames, Bobby's steady leadership and ear for harmony turned a small Southern group into something magnetic. Brown began behind the drums, keeping time while Bobby carried the vocals and spirit of the band. But it didn't take long before everyone noticed the intensity in Brown's performance, the way he moved, the way his voice cracked with emotion. Bobby saw it too. Instead of feeling threatened, he leaned into it. He gave Brown space to lead, knowing that his own gift wasn't in standing in front, but in building the foundation that others could rise upon. That decision would define his life, an act of humility and wisdom that few ever recognized. Under Byrd's guidance, the Flames evolved from a small-town R&B act to a group with national potential. They rehearsed endlessly, refining harmonies and stage moves until their shows felt like sermons. The gospel roots remained in every shout, every note. What they were doing was more than entertainment. It was energy, raw and alive, drawn from the same places as faith and survival. When they signed to Federal Records, they added a new word to their name, the Famous Flames. It sounded bold, maybe even a little arrogant, but they believed in it. Together, they recorded their first single, Please, Please, Please. Bobby co-wrote the song with Johnny Terry, but the label decided to release it under a new name, James Brown and the Famous Flames. That single decision shifted the balance forever. The song exploded across the South, selling over 1 million copies and turning Brown into a rising star. But for the rest of the group, especially Bobby, it was bittersweet. Their names were printed smaller, or sometimes not at all. Reporters began asking for James Brown's Band. Radio DJs forgot the rest of the title. What had started as a brotherhood was slowly becoming a one-man show. Still, Bobby stayed. He handled the business side, arranged rehearsals, and even mediated the growing tensions inside the group. His calm kept things running when egos flared. To the outside world, he was the background singer. To those inside, he was the reason anything worked. By the early 1960s, the Famous Flames had become one of the most electrifying acts in America. They recorded Try Me, Think, and I'll Go Crazy, songs that would shape the future of soul. On stage, Brown gave the fire. Bobby gave the form. The balance between them, preacher and architect, made their music unforgettable. There were moments when Bobby could have walked away, taken his own talent somewhere else. But loyalty ran deep in him. He believed in the dream they had built together, even when his own light was dimmed by another's shadow. He once said, "If I had walked away back then, maybe I would have been bigger, but I wouldn't have been me." For Bobby Byrd, greatness wasn't measured by fame. It was measured by the music and by the men it lifted along the way. Success came fast, but peace never followed. By 1959, the Famous Flames were performing night after night across the South, turning small-town stages into firestorms of rhythm. Bobby handled the harmonies and arrangements, while James Brown commanded the spotlight with his raw energy and sweat-soaked charisma. Together, they built something unstoppable, a sound that bridged gospel and groove, sacred and secular. Their 1,963 Live at the Apollo album changed everything. Recorded in a single take, it captured the wild intensity of their shows, the screams, the sweat, the syncopation. Critics called it one of the most electrifying live albums ever made. For Bobby, it was both triumph and confirmation. The vision they started in those small churches had reached the world. But fame has its own rhythm, one that moves faster than loyalty can keep up. Labels and promoters began framing everything around one name, James Brown. Magazine covers, interviews, record sleeves, the spotlight grew narrower, and Bobby's place within it began to fade. He didn't complain. He kept the band tight, arranged the harmonies, and continued to write. Songs like Lost Someone carried his fingerprints, even when his name wasn't printed on the record. He watched as their success exploded into pop culture Ed Sullivan appearances, film cameos, concerts where audiences fainted from the sheer intensity. And through it all, Bobby stood just a few steps behind the man he had helped become a legend. When the Famous Flames performed Please, Please, Please Live, Bobby's voice would echo behind Brown's wails, lifting the emotion higher. He wasn't a background singer, he was the gravity holding the show together. Yet the myth of James Brown as a solo act grew stronger. By the mid-1960s, most fans didn't even realize the Flames were a vocal group, not a backing band. The confusion hurt, but Bobby refused bitterness. He often said, "If I stopped believing in the music, what would be left of me?" So he kept working, producing, arranging, pushing the band toward something new, and that something would soon redefine American sound. In 1970, after years of soul, the world was ready for something dirtier, rougher, more physical. Bobby and James called it funk. It wasn't polished, it was pure rhythm, pure attitude. And once again, Bobby Byrd was there at the foundation. When Brown shouted, "Get up!" on stage, it was Bobby's voice answering back, giving the line its echo, its command. They had come full circle, from gospel harmonies to the raw pulse of funk, from Sunday mornings to Saturday nights. But even as the crowds grew, so did the cracks in their friendship. Fame had turned into pressure, and trust began to thin. Still, on stage, something magical remained. Bobby's baritone grounded Brown's fire. Their chemistry couldn't be rehearsed. It came from years of brotherhood, one that began on a dusty field in Georgia and survived through decades of triumph and exhaustion. By the early 1970s, Bobby had his own solo hits, "I Need Help" and "I Know You Got Soul," both testaments to his creative voice. Yet even then, the world saw him as James Brown's man. The irony was painful. He had helped build the Godfather's throne but was never given a crown of his own. And yet, he never spoke of resentment. To Bobby Byrd, legacy wasn't about headlines. It was about harmony, the delicate balance between giving and being seen. By the late 1960s, soul was no longer just a sound, it was a movement. In church halls, in city clubs, in protest marches, the rhythm of soul carried the heartbeat of a changing America. And in the center of it stood two men, one in the spotlight, the other in the shadows, shaping the music that would become funk. Bobby Byrd was now more than a singer. He was an arranger, a producer, a band leader, and above all, the quiet force behind James Brown's empire. Together they founded Fair Deal Productions, a business venture meant to give them creative control over their music. It was an ambitious dream, one that would take rhythm and blues out of its box and bring it to the world. When the industry shifted, they shifted with it. Brown's fire was the face, but Byrd's discipline was the structure. He managed rehearsals, organized tours, kept the band paid, and guided the creative sessions that defined a generation. When James Brown was the energy, Bobby Byrd was the order. Their partnership produced one of the most iconic live recordings in history, Live at the Apollo. Critics praised its precision and intensity, but what they didn't see was Bobby behind the curtain, cueing harmonies, keeping timing, shaping every transition. That discipline gave Brown the freedom to explode on stage. Without Bobby, the chaos would have never found rhythm. In 1970, when Brown's band suddenly quit before a show, it was Bobby who saved the night. Within hours, he recruited brothers Bootsy and Catfish Collins, assembled new players, and walked them straight into the spotlight. No rehearsal, no warning, just instinct and courage. That night birthed the JBs, one of the most influential funk bands in history. Soon after, they recorded "Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine." The track was a revolution, all groove, no filler, pure movement. And there it was again, that echoing call and response between Brown and Byrd, the same chemistry that had defined them since the beginning. One voice shouted the command, the other confirmed it, two sides of the same rhythm. While the world heard only Brown's cry, it was Bobby's tone underneath that gave the song its weight. He was the counterpoint, the grounding soul that kept the fire steady. But Byrd wasn't only a collaborator, he was an artist in his own right. Around the same time, he began releasing solo material that captured his distinct sound, soulful, gritty, and optimistic. "Baby, Baby, Baby" with Anna King revealed his softer side. "I Need Help, I Can't Do It Alone," and "I Know You Got Soul" showed the funk visionary he had become. For Bobby Byrd, the stage had always been a kind of pulpit not for preaching, but for truth. When he sang, he carried every sermon from his childhood church, every mile of southern road he'd traveled, every moment of loyalty that had defined his life. At the peak of his career, he had what most artists never find: purpose. He was the architect of sound, the builder of rhythm that gave a generation its voice. At the height of their success, the music felt invincible. Funk had taken over America. It was in the streets, the airwaves, the way people moved. And behind that unstoppable rhythm stood Bobby Byrd and James Brown, two men who seemed destined to create together forever. But even the strongest grooves can fall out of sync. By the early 1970s, fame had changed everything. The spotlight that once felt warm began to burn. James Brown was now a household name, the godfather of soul, while Bobby Byrd's contributions remained hidden in liner notes and backroom credits. What had started as partnership had quietly turned into hierarchy. Bobby tried to keep peace. He was the calm in the storm, managing the band when tempers flared and egos clashed. But the more successful Brown became, the less room there was for anyone else's voice. Contracts were signed without discussion. Credits were misplaced or missing. The rhythm that once united them began to divide. Still, Bobby stayed. He believed that loyalty mattered more than fame. For nearly 2 decades, he had built Brown's career brick by brick, organizing the shows, rehearsing the band, writing songs, and even smoothing over financial disputes. To the public, he was the hype man. To those inside the circle, he was the reason the machine kept running. But loyalty can also be heavy. It asks you to carry silence when you should be speaking. As People Records launched in 1971, Bobby hoped it would mark a new era, a label where both men could thrive as equals. He released I Know You Got Soul under the label, a track that captured everything he'd been preaching since the 1950, rhythm, spirit, and the voice of community. The song became a minor hit, but recognition was fleeting. When radio DJs mentioned People Records, they still said one name, James Brown. Behind the scenes, frustration grew. Bobby began to notice that royalties for songs he'd co-written Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine, Talkin' Loud and Sayin' Nothing, and others weren't reaching him. When he questioned the paperwork, answers came slowly or not at all. Brown's circle had tightened, and Bobby was being left outside. Personal life added another layer of tension. Bobby had fallen in love with singer Vicki Anderson, one of Brown's own vocalists. The relationship strained their already fragile bond. What had once been brotherhood now carried the weight of pride and betrayal. The breaking point came in 1973. After 21 years of shared history, from the juvenile baseball field to the biggest stages in the world, Bobby Byrd walked away. No public fight, no dramatic headline, just a quiet exit from the noise he had helped create. Without him, James Brown's empire began to wobble. The rhythm was still there, but the balance was gone. Brown himself once said, "Without Bobby, I lost my right hand." But by then, it was too late. For Bobby, leaving wasn't just about business, it was survival. He needed peace, even if it meant obscurity. The fame, the lights, the endless applause, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was dignity. He returned home to Georgia, carrying the silence of someone who had seen it all, the rise, the glory, and the cost. On stage, the music was perfection. Off stage, it had turned into a lesson that even the brightest partnerships can fade when one name takes all the light. When Bobby Byrd finally walked away in 1973, it wasn't with anger or spectacle. There were no headlines, no cameras waiting by the door, just a man leaving the noise he had built. After 21 years beside James Brown, Bobby chose silence over applause. The decision wasn't sudden. It had been forming for years through missed credits, unpaid royalties, and unspoken tension. Each time his name was left off a record, a little more of his spirit faded. The man who had once been the foundation of the sound now felt like a ghost in his own creation. Fame had become a machine, and Bobby no longer recognized the rhythm. He had given everything, his youth, his faith, his patience, only to see his legacy written under another name. But even in that heartbreak, there was no bitterness in his tone. He used to say, "If you keep your peace, you keep your soul." After leaving, Bobby tried to start anew. He poured his focus into his solo work, recording songs that carried both pain and pride. I Know You Got Soul found new life among fans who understood his message that rhythm could come from resilience. But in the industry, recognition was still scarce. Without James Brown's shadow, few knew where to find him. For the first time in his life, Bobby wasn't leading a band or managing a stage. He was learning to live quietly. He settled in Georgia with his wife, Vicki Anderson, the same woman whose love had once fueled the rift between him and Brown. Together, they built a life away from the spotlight, one grounded in faith, family, and forgiveness. The silence was strange at first. For decades, Bobby had been surrounded by sound, the echo of applause, the hiss of vinyl, the thump of drums in darkened rooms. Now, mornings began with the hum of cicadas, the rustle of trees outside his window. For most people, that silence might have felt like loss. For Bobby, it was healing. He still spoke kindly of Brown, even when others expected resentment. "We did something together that'll never be done again," he told a friend. "That's what I remember." But deep down, the hurt remained. The lack of credit wasn't just about money, it was about memory. Without written proof, history forgets. And for Bobby Byrd, being forgotten was the one thing he had never feared until now. As the years passed, he stayed close to music, occasionally performing, always mentoring younger artists who admired his discipline and humility. They called him the gentleman of funk. It was true. Bobby Byrd never stopped being the backbone, even when the stage lights no longer reached him. He had once built an empire out of rhythm. Now, he was rebuilding himself out of grace. The years after Bobby Byrd left, James Brown were quiet, but not without echoes. His name lingered in the music, those deep grooves, the call and response patterns, the structure behind the chaos. People still danced to the rhythm he helped build, even if they didn't know it was his. In the mid-1970s, he returned briefly to the studio. Songs like Back from the Dead carried both defiance and hope, a statement that he wasn't finished yet. But the industry had changed. Funk was evolving, and so was the public's attention. Younger artists were taking over the charts, many of them unknowingly tracing the same rhythmic blueprint Bobby had helped design years before. He didn't chase fame anymore. He recorded, toured a little, then quietly stepped back. Music had been his life, but family became his purpose. At home in Georgia, he and Vicki Anderson raised their children, balancing the ordinary joys of family with the extraordinary memories of what once was. Then, years later, came a reminder that the past never truly stays buried. In the early 2000s, Bobby and members of the famous Flames filed a lawsuit against James Brown and Universal Music, claiming unpaid royalties for songs they had written and performed. For decades, the paperwork had credited Brown alone, the same pattern that had followed Bobby through his entire career. It wasn't about revenge, it was about recognition, about being seen. But the case was dismissed. Too much time had passed. The statute of limitations had closed the door once again. Still, justice found another way to reach him. In 2001, rapper Jay-Z sampled Bobby's "I'm Not to Blame" for his track "You Don't Know" on the Blueprint album. Unlike so many before, Jay-Z reached out directly. He gave Bobby 65% of the song's rights, enough for Byrd and his family to pay off their home and find financial peace. It wasn't the millions he deserved, but it was a gesture of respect. For Bobby, it wasn't about the money. It was about being remembered. Knowing that younger generations from hip-hop to R&B still carried his rhythm forward meant everything. He returned to the stage a few times in the 1990s, often beside James Brown once more. They performed together on special occasions, their chemistry still intact even after years apart. When Brown faced legal troubles in 1991, Bobby was there not as a partner in business, but as a brother in forgiveness. And when Brown passed away in December 2006, Bobby performed Sex Machine in tribute at his burial. The circle had finally closed. Two men who had built an era, reunited one last time under the weight of memory. In the following year, Bobby's own health began to fade. On the 12th of September 2007, he passed away from cancer at 73. No headlines, no noise, just the quiet departure of a man whose music never stopped playing. And though history almost forgot his name, his sound lived on in every drumbeat, every funk bass line, every soul that ever learned to get up and move. Long after Bobby Byrd left the stage, his music refused to stay silent. The rhythm he built, that tight, syncopated groove between church and street, became the foundation of modern soul, funk, and hip-hop. Even if his name rarely appeared in headlines, his fingerprints were everywhere. Every time a bass line dropped heavy or a voice shouted over a horn section, you could feel him there. That was Bobby, the architect behind the beat. His influence lived on not through statues or trophies, but through sound itself. In the 1980 and 1990, as a new generation of producers began sampling old funk records, they rediscovered Bobby's catalog. I Know You Got Soul, Hot Pants, I Need Help, I Can't Do It Alone. These tracks became the DNA of hip-hop. Eric B. and Rakim turned I Know You Got Soul into an anthem, connecting the streets of New York back to the church halls of Georgia. Public Enemy, N.W. A. LL Cool J. They all built on the grooves that Bobby helped create. For years, young artists searched for that raw, human sound, the one that made you move even when you didn't want to. And every time they sampled a Bobby Byrd record, they found it. He was in the heartbeat of their rhythm, guiding them even from decades away. Video games and films brought him to new audiences. In 2004, Grand Theft Auto, San Andreas featured I Know You Got Soul and Hot Pants, pumping his rhythm into millions of homes. A year later, Indigo Prophecy used Try It Again, reintroducing him to a generation that had never held a vinyl record. His voice, once confined to smoky clubs and dusty studios, now traveled through speakers across the world. But his legacy wasn't only musical, it was moral. Bobby Byrd showed what it meant to build, to give, to stand behind something greater than yourself. In a world obsessed with fame, he embodied something rarer: integrity. When people remembered him, they spoke not just of his sound, but his character, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence, the way he treated bandmates like family, the way he never let bitterness erase gratitude. His story became a quiet parable for artists who came after him, a reminder that greatness isn't always loud, and recognition doesn't always arrive on time. When he sang I Know You Got Soul, it wasn't just a lyric, it was his philosophy. He believed that every note, every rhythm, every word had spirit, that music wasn't about perfection, but connection. In the years after his death, his influence only grew stronger. Each sample, each tribute, each rediscovery turned his absence into presence. The man who once stood in the shadows of another legend was now being recognized as a legend in his own right, the backbone of an entire genre. Bobby Byrd didn't just play funk, he was funk, disciplined, soulful, unbreakable. Recognition came slowly for Bobby Byrd decades after the lights had faded and the crowds had moved on. But when it finally arrived, it felt like the world was catching up to something it had overlooked for far too long. In 2015, 8 years after his passing, Bobby was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a member of the JBs. The honor was more than a title. It was an acknowledgement that the foundation of funk and soul had never been a one-man story. His name was finally carved into the same walls as the artists he had once lifted with his voice and hands. Then, in 2020, the National Rhythm and Blues Hall of Fame honored him again, naming him one of the architects of soul. The recognition wasn't just symbolic, it was a correction, a quiet rewriting of music history. For every artist who had ever been overshadowed, Bobby's name became proof that truth can't stay buried forever. Music historians began revisiting his catalog, uncovering songs and credits that had been long forgotten. They traced the threads of his influence through every genre, from the gospel harmonies of the 1950 to the pulse of hip-hop beats 50 years later. They realized that without Bobby Byrd, much of what we call modern funk simply wouldn't exist. But beyond the awards and the analysis, what truly mattered was how people remembered him. In interviews, fellow musicians didn't talk about business or fame. They talked about the man, about his discipline, his humility, and his belief that music should unite, not divide. He was remembered as the one who showed up early, who kept rehearsals running when others gave up, who smiled even when the credits went missing. To many, he wasn't just a bandmate, he was the moral compass of an era that often lost its way in pursuit of glory. American audiences, especially those who had lived through the golden years of soul, began to see Bobby not as a supporting act, but as a symbol of endurance, the quiet worker behind the movement, the man who didn't need the front page to leave a mark. His story resonated beyond America, too. In Europe and Japan, collectors reissued his records, calling them blueprints of groove. Young musicians studied his phrasing, his timing, his ability to make rhythm sound like conversation. Every rediscovery was like finding a hidden layer in the story of black music, one that had always been there, waiting to be heard. When people speak of Bobby Byrd now, they don't talk about what he lost. They talk about what he gave: the sound, the structure, the spirit. He didn't just contribute to James Brown's legacy, he made it possible. And in the end, that's the quiet kind of immortality artists dream of: not statues, not headlines, but the knowledge that your work became part of the human rhythm. Bobby Byrd may have stood behind the spotlight, but his light never went out. It simply kept shining through others, through every song, every echo, every soul that ever felt the beat he helped create. The lights fade again, just as they did all those years ago. A single microphone stands in the center of an empty stage, quiet, patient, waiting. For a moment, it feels as if the world has stopped to listen. You can almost hear him, somewhere between the echoes, counting the band in one more time. Bobby Byrd never needed the applause. He needed the truth, the knowledge that his sound, his rhythm, his discipline had changed the course of music. He was never the loudest man in the room, but he was always the one who kept time when everyone else lost it. His story isn't about revenge or fame. It's about legacy, the kind that doesn't fade when the crowd goes home. He built bridges between gospel and funk, between soul and survival. He showed that greatness isn't always in the spotlight. Sometimes, it's standing just behind it, holding everything together. When James Brown shouted, "Get up," it was Bobby who answered back. When the world moved to that rhythm, they were dancing to the sound he helped create. That's what makes his story unforgettable. And maybe that's what Stars Underrated is really about: not the forgotten, but the remembered. The ones who gave everything, not for fame, but for the music itself. Bobby Byrd's voice still lives in every beat that makes you move, in every song that tells the truth about struggle and faith. His life reminds us that history isn't just written by those in the spotlight, it's carried by the ones who stayed in the shadows so the light could shine brighter. So the next time you hear that groove, that deep, unshakable rhythm, remember the man who made it possible, the man who built a sound that never stopped moving. Because legends don't fade, they echo. If this story moved you, take a moment to honor Bobby Byrd. Leave a comment, share your favorite song, or tell us what his music means to you. Do you think he ever got the respect he truly deserved? And if you believe stories like his deserve to be remembered, subscribe to the channel. Help us keep the light alive for the artists who built Hollywood, one note at a time. Because here at Stars Underrated, we remember. We remember the music, the struggle, and the souls who made it all possible.